Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We're really pleased to have Peter Davis with us this afternoon for our final paper. Peter is always a popular speaker. He's well known as the former Mayor of Port Lincoln and being quite outspoken at times. And we did bump shoulders together, didn't we, a few times on local government. But Peter's going to talk today really about the Transcontinental Railway, its construction, its financing, and I'm sure he's going to tell you, but I'll beat him to it. It's celebrating 100 years next weekend at Port Augusta, 100 years since it was constructed. But from the League of Rights point of view, we're very interested in the way it was financed, and I'm sure he's going to touch on that. So without any further ado, please welcome Peter Davis.
I was listening to the radio, the ABC, when former Deputy Prime Minister Tim Fischer was talking, and you probably know Tim as a pretty voluble speaker, particularly when he's talking about railways and so on. And on this particular occasion, he was talking about the construction and the delivery of the Transcontinental Railway line, which commenced in 1912 and was completed in 1917 on the 17th of October in 3 days' time. It's the centenary. Now, I'm not aware that there is to be a centenary, as you said. There is there? Well, that's good. It interests me that it's not been publicised. Well, not as far as I'm concerned. But perhaps to me, the greater achievement was how the nation financed the construction of that railway line. And through the course of this speech, which I wrote several months ago, after having tried to get hold of Tim, and as I'll speak about it in the body of the speech, I decided I'd write it, and I was asked because, I will make plain, Tim is unable to be with us today. He wasn't very well at the time. National Director Ken asked me would I be prepared to stand in his place. I had hoped that with the information that I'd given the Honourable Tim Fischer, that he would go away and do some financial research into how that railway was financed. Because remember this, right now we've got the current Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, who's trying, apart from some of the other things that he wants to deliver, is I'm not sure whether it's high speed, but a rail link from Melbourne to Sydney to Brisbane. And he doesn't know where he's going to get the $8.4 billion that they think it's going to cost. Okay, that was from where the talk that Tim Fischer gave, probably to Ian McNamara. I'm not quite sure who the interviewer was, but like always with rail, he was fascinating. What he knows about railways is amazing. What he doesn't know is how it was financed. So here we go. The subject is celebrating the financing and construction of the Transcontinental Railway line between 1912 and 1917. First, I'd like to express my appreciation for the trust demonstrated by our League executive in offering me the opportunity to speak to you all today about an extraordinary period in our nation's history. For a short period of about 11 years, our nation broke free from the shackles of the privately controlled financial banking system. It's an honour to be in front of you all today, and I hope you find the talk stimulating, rewarding, and please, if you can, convey to your friends and relatives the thrust of what I'm saying, because unless this information gets out, if it just stays in the 40 or 50 of us here today, I might as well have stayed on my silly little island and watched the tide coming in and going out, wherever Alan Moran is. It's absolutely crucial that until our young folk particularly get to understand the sheer corruption, and Alan touched on that relative to speech about global warming and AGL and company, that it is so easy, if the show is financed correctly, if sovereign credit is used rather than private credit, things change, as you'll hear. So the fundamental reason I'm here is that Tim Fischer was being interviewed, and I think it was on ABC radio perhaps 6 months ago. He was talking about the construction of the transcontinental rail line and out on the Nullarbor Plain, as you know. And he was talking about a remote place called Uldea, which is, Uldea is approximately 620 miles or 1,000 k's east of Kalgoorlie and about 430 miles west of Port Augusta, and it's desert country. You can't push a piece of 8-gauge wire very far in the ground. To say it's remote, and you've got to remember this is 100 years ago. Blokes are out there, no air conditioning, no worrying about whether the power's going to work to power our tent tonight. They were out there in the heat and the cold of the desert in the wintertime, because it took 5 years to build the thing, the railway line. To say it is remote is a gross understatement, and I found Tim's talk about the construction and the difficulties endured in building the transcontinental riveting listening. Perhaps you're familiar with Tim Fischer's remarkable knowledge of railways and rolling stock. I thought about his talk for a few days with two little birdies. I got a big empty space in there, and these birds are going around and around saying Transcontinental Railway Line and the Commonwealth Bank. And eventually I connected the two, the linkage between the two. The one financing the other, and with no national debt. Now, to give you some idea of what's happening with national debt right now, remember that Malcolm Turnbull is a financier, was the managing director or the chairman of the board of the Western Pacific operations of Goldman Sachs, which is probably one of the biggest, without a doubt, one of the biggest privately owned banks in the world in America. And the last thing he wants to touch is sovereign credit or national credit. He wants national debt, which he's delivering to you at the rate of $100 million per week. Okay? That's the rate at which the Australian national debt is building. To give you some, you might remember, what's his name, Tony Abbott was elected on the basis of better financial management when he managed to get rid of, Kevin Rudd. At that time, when the Liberal Party regained power, the Australian, I think that was 2013, the national debt then was 213 billion. Right now, our boys in Canberra are trying to push through legislation. The current debt is approaching 485 billion. In other words, they've more than managed to double it in 4 years, 3-4 years, and they want to take the debt ceiling to 500 billion. It's ludicrous stuff. Anyway, our nation was suffering, this is 1914, our nation was suffering a shocking drought and the First World War had commenced. The CBA had been created in 1911 with a grant of £11,000 or thereabouts from the federal government. It was owned by the federal parliament and it was financing the nation through the war, through the duration of the First World War. It created out of thin air, same as the national debt's being created out of thin air, about £360 million. And you've got to allow for inflation, it's billions of dollars. No national debt. It was carrying drought-stricken farmers, helping first homeowners and financing the railway line. All from an initial investment of just on, in dollar terms, not allowing for inflation, $24,000, thereabouts. You'd have to call it $1 million, would be about at least $1 million. It may not be $2 million. But we are now talking billions to build a railway line, yet these people, 100 years ago, in 3 days' time, completed 1,600 miles of railway line through one of the worst, most difficult places in the world, at the same time as financing the First World War and helping farmers and helping first. It's an amazing story. And incidentally, I'll get to the little booklets in due course. Anyway, I talked about the two little birdies buzzing around my little brain. The first birdie settled, and that was how King O'Malley was an American banker who came to Australia, and in fact he was first elected to the state parliament of South Australia. He represented the seat of the Fleurieu Peninsula and Kangaroo Island. You can go into Parliament House today if you're ever invited there, into the visitors gallery, where bunnies like me and Ken used to go and might have a cup of tea or something with the members. And around the wall are all the heads of the previous members of Parliament. One day I'm sitting in there in the chair with Graham Gunn, who was the member for Stewart, I think, the far west of Eyre Peninsula. And I'm rattling on to, there's half a dozen pollies trying to pacify the mad mayor, and I'm lecturing them like I am you poor souls. And I'm saying, "That's King, oh look, there he is up there, that's him up there." And I hadn't heard. He got given the flip by the electorate, and he finished up elected into the seat of Denison in Tasmania. And there because he understood banking from America, he and, I'll get back to my written story, how King O'Malley and Andrew Fisher, who was the then Labor Prime Minister, pushed through our federal parliament the legislation establishing the Commonwealth Bank of Australia in 1912, and it was colloquially known as the People's Bank. The second birdie settled when I recalled how the People's Bank had financed the construction of the Transcontinental Railway line. There were trials and tribulations, not just the railway physical problems of the railway workers constructing, the Fetler gangs and so on, in shocking conditions, 40, 45 degree heat, freezing cold at night in the winter time, typhoid. They had all sorts of disease issues. It was incredible. Anyway, they kept working, constructing the railway, but in some ways, the mental turmoil back in Canberra, the mental pressures that Andrew Fisher and King O'Malley and the eventually appointed chairman or the governor of the reserve of the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, his name is, as you'll hear, he was then Mr. Denison Miller, and he was the manager of the Rural Bank of New South Wales. So we'll get back to what I've written. Massive political pressure from various opponents, contractors trying to overcharge for the materials required, and incidentally, remembering what Alan Moran was telling us about the likes of AGL and whoever else trying to overcharge and get a subsidy from government, BHP was one of the companies trying to overcharge the people of Australia for the steel involved. It's not a very pretty story, but the government prevailed. The national financing of the railway, that had set my mind racing in circles seeking an answer. And the answer was the second birdie that came to rest. How I got hold of Tim Fisher's telephone number and address, I don't remember. I think I may have contacted Arnie. He just held his hand up. Arnie traced it via the internet or whatever. And eventually I wrote a letter to him enclosing a couple of little booklets which I'll refer to later on. And lo and behold, he rang me. He rang me, which just threw me, He just said, it's Tim Fisher speaking, Mr. Davis. I appreciated your letter and the two little booklets. Until he said the two little booklets, I had no idea who I was talking to. That's true. To my surprise, Tim telephoned me, expressing both interest and appreciation for the booklets. He then suffered me for at least 40 minutes as I strongly suggested he should be the key speaker at Uldir or wherever the main celebrations will occur in 3 days' time, remembering that today is the 14th of October. I asked our league to extend via Ken and Arnie an invitation to Tim to speak with us, but sadly he conveyed to our national director that on medical advice he, Tim, should avoid all travel and declined Ken's invitation. So this speech, it is a poor substitute for a previous Deputy Prime Minister, but it comes with my, and I suspect our collective best wishes and a return to his good health. So, second, how should I address you relative to the centenary of our Transcontinental Railway line? I think you'll find that it'll basically go unsung through the main media. Never mind the more important factor of how it was financed. I spent many hours considering how to convey what the CBA delivered through from 1912 through to 1924, when the Bruce Page Conservative government quite deliberately commenced the privatisation of the People's Bank. Stanley Melbourne Bruce had been awarded, I think it was a military, he was a very brave man, but he was a businessman. He was the Prime Minister of the two, Bruce, and Page was his Deputy Prime Minister, but it was known as the Bruce Page Conservative government. Brave man in the First World War, but he commenced the sellout of the People's Bank. So then I had a third little birdie flying around in my brain, and its message was simple. The Transcontinental stands as irrefutable truth of what our great-grandfathers delivered and how it was financed. It is up to people like me to spread the truth concerning how that rail line was financed. That was that little birdie's message. I will not explain how now Sir Denison Miller, the founding governor, delivered Australia 10 years of basically national debt-free development and prosperity. The little booklets, and this is what I'd like you, I don't know how many copies of these that the League still has, but if you speak with Beata afterwards, or any of the League, I see Lucy back there. Boxes. Well, that's wonderful. Buy boxes, please, troops. Given to your children and your grandchildren for Christmas. One's called The Story of the Commonwealth Bank. And then there are actually 2 or 3 volumes of other Commonwealth government investments in things like, well, I'll get the one that really matters relative to the Transcontinental Railway line. The Story of Commonwealth Oil Refineries and the Search for Oil. Can you believe this? I cart fuel out to my island in 44-gallon drums. They are galvanised iron 44s. On the top, indented in the steel is probably, in today's language, 3 millimetres thick. They have to be 60, 70 years old. In them is indented BPCOR, Commonwealth Oil Refineries. Okay? And then the second story in this little booklet, the story of the Commonwealth Railways and the note issue. Remember, do, if you can, buy them and give them as a present to your children and grandchildren or your friends. Those 2 booklets are priceless in terms of preserving our history of 100 years ago. And the reason I'm saying that, rather than telling you the travails and the difficulties and, you know, the flies and the mosquitoes and yakety yak and blah, 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 far better to read it in an irrefutable form out of these booklets, because in the back of them are the parliamentary references, the Hansard transcripts and so on. They can't be disputed, the truth. So I'll tell you a little bit about Sir Denison Miller and his role as the governor. He had been the governor of the managing director of the Rural Bank of New South Wales. Now, I happened to be travelling some years ago with 2 very strong League executive personnel. These names will ring with some of you, Jim Cronin and Bill Carey, through outback New South Wales and Queensland. They were drought-stricken in all sorts of bother. And Jim Cronin and Bill Carey, I was out on the very perimeter. They were helping broken down, virtually bankrupted farmers from being sold up by the banks who allegedly wanted their money back. Now, we went into Griffith to stay overnight, and so I get out, and this banking issue's always sort of interested me, and we're walking around. We went to a motel, wherever. I'm standing on this intersection, and I see the Rural Bank of New South Wales over there, and I'm standing here out the front of the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, the office there. And I suddenly remembered that when the Commonwealth Bank of Australia started trading, the other private banks would not exchange the Commonwealth Bank of Australia cheques and cash them. But because Mr. Denison Miller at this stage, had come from the Rural Bank of New South Wales, he organised for them to walk diagonally across whatever is the main road in Griffith and exchange one another's cheques. I don't know what they call it, clearing cheques. And because that busted the private banking cartel, the other banks had no option but to start exchanging Commonwealth Bank of Australia, which at that time was debt-free money, within their system. And that's how this whole financing, not just of the transcontinental, but the First World War, first home loan. How would you like a first home loan of 25 to 30 years duration at about 2.5%, maybe 2.75%, 2 payments per year? That's the deal. 25 years time paid off. Unbelievable stuff. He organised with his £12,000, no more government money. He organised pools to protect farmers from international traders beating down the price of wheat and wool and meat, you name it. Amazing. The thrust of all that is that it's not just the transcontinental that we should be celebrating, but this whole financial system, sovereign government power, or sovereign government people's wealth, effectively, controlled by the government. That's the key, and that's what we've lost. That's what matters. And it was him being able to walk, to deal across the road that broke the vice-like grip that private money had on Australia at that time. So I've given us a plug, our members a plug today. The truth shall set you free is the thrust of what I'm driving at. Now that's a biblical statement, that you probably know that. And that turned my mind to some historical facts that are as true today as they were several thousand years ago. Thus, this very brief history of the creation and control of credit by private sources. The earliest critic of private credit creation I have found was an ancient ruler of the Sumerian people, and we're talking about 3,500, 4,000 years ago. Hammurabi banned the practice with penalty of death by stoning those people practicing interest-bearing credit creation back in 1780 BC. Now, my reference book is, I say is, because it's possible the League may still have some. Like you people are here today, I happen to be here, I don't know, 4 or 5, whatever it was, years ago. And I happened to see a little booklet called, or not a booklet, it's a beautifully written book, The Babylonian Woe, written by the late Commander David Assel of the Royal Navy, British naval officer. Within Hammurabi's laws, he was the ruler of the, 400 or 500 square miles. His little kingdom was based on the ancient city of which has been rediscovered. It's on the banks of the Euphrates River. And he developed what came to be known as the Code of Hammurabi. In each of his little villages, he had decreed that they were called stels, like a granite plinth, on which were carved the 278 laws, so that the whole of his kingdom could read the laws and the penalties applying to whatever the crime. And generally the crime was stoning, by being stoned to death. Now, only one of these stels still remain. It's in the Louvre in France. Thus, law number 7 relates to the creation and control of credit, and he didn't like what was going on with private money changes, death if they got caught. So let us march forward 1,700 years to about 55 BC, and we find a chap by the name of Gaius Julius Caesar invading Great Britain. And you probably recall his words, I came, I saw, I conquered. Well, he also saw coal and iron ore, and the locals making iron objects. And this is a bit of a parody, you might say, or you've got to try and get a bit of humour and show, like, it's pretty heavy going when you're suffering me, and I thank you for it. So being short of ready cash to pay his men and being a long way from home, he found a solution to his money shortage. He created what came to be known as fiat money, and I'm not referring to the Italian, thus Roman, car manufacturer. The modern interpretation of fiat was, and incidentally still is, let it be. He decreed values for these different coins, okay? Let it be 5 cents, 10 cents, $10, whatever. Julius Caesar decreed the locals make iron coins with specific values imprinted upon the coin faces, but they actually possessed virtually no intrinsic value. In passing, it's worth pointing out that Julius's fiat system continues to this day. By way of example, common sense dictates that the intrinsic value of today's $5 note is effectively the same as a $100 note. That is, they're both worthless, and yet we think they're worth $100. But as a civilised people, we accept the given printed face value. It's how we trade. It's a wonderful thing, and it should not be privately controlled. Exactly the same applies with our coins. Their intrinsic value is next to zero. Whilst on the subject of a ruler or government issuing currency or money, it's paramount to remember that today the only legal tender, you've probably heard those words, legal tender, that is notes and coins. Notes and coins is the only legal tender still to this day. And they are still, I say they because there are two mints in Australia, one in Perth, one in Canberra. They're owned by the Commonwealth Government, and not surprisingly, Parliament, those clowns that we elect, they're trying to privatise them. Unbelievable. The Royal Mints in Canberra and Perth are owned by the Federal Parliament, or the people of Australia. Now, the next important thing to remember about our notes and coins, that legal tender is less than 3% of what we call money circulating in Australia. All the rest, the 97% rest, is credit, which we call money, controlled by the private banking system, okay? And from which the Commonwealth Government is increasing the supply by selling bonds through the Treasury, which, you know, the banks write a cheque, or they don't write a cheque anymore, they just push the buttons on a computer, and so the Commonwealth gets another $100 million for next week, and we pick up a liability not only to repay the $100 million but at interest. So this effectively costless credit owned by the private banking system is issued as an interest-bearing debt by our banking system. The point of all this is to remember the historic truth that he who pays the piper calls the tune. Have you heard that little yarn? Well, he is the credit source, or the bank. The piper is the borrower or the debtor, and the tune is the use to which the money is permitted to be put by he, the bank, or private banks. There's so many truths within these old sayings that we've got, and that's a ripper, that one. If I may digress for a moment, you need to know that our private banks are publicly planning to make Australia a cashless society by 2020. This will place all governments and our people under the complete control of private world financial interests. International global banking will be calling the tune, and thus he who pays the piper, to which we will all be required to dance. It's obvious. If there's no cash in circulation, cash meaning notes and coins, the private banking system has complete control of government, people, the world. So let us return to the Transcontinental. He was our Commonwealth Bank of Australia, then totally owned by Federal Parliament, us, the people. The piper or borrower was the government, building our own national asset, the railway line. The tune was the delivered railway line, and it sung a wonderful song for 100 years, as that, I've said thousands, hundreds of thousands of tonnes of freight, and goodness knows how many hundreds of thousands of people have travelled east and west on the Transcontinental. Back to ancient history. About 80 years after Julius Caesar was murdered, remember, he got killed because, amongst other things, he created some interest-free... He went outside the banking system, the Roman banking system. Jesus Christ arrived, and the Romans tolerated him and his message until he entered the temple, and he evicted them. You know, he whipped the money changers, who were the private bankers then, out of the temple. They were the private bankers of that era. Jesus taught us how to pray with his prayer, "Our Father which art in heaven," and so on and so forth. Now, if you still possess... How many of you got a King James I? Don't stick your hands up, but if you've got a King James I Bible, please check me. read Matthew chapter 6 verse 12. You will see the words he stated. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Okay? Forgive us that right off the debt. It was this issue of the creation and control of money that he attacked. It was the only time that in the recorded history of the Bible that Jesus actually became violent, when he whipped the money changers out of the temple. And then shortly after chapter 6 verse 12, if you go to about, verse 20, he starts talking about mammon, which is money. You cannot serve both God and I'm not trying to convert you to Christianity. You take and make your own minds up. But his financial attack was the thing that inflamed effectively the private banking system, the Sadducees or the Caiaphas and his merry men. And they effectively approached Pontius Pilate and forced him to effectively crucify Jesus. They murdered him effectively. It was that issue of the control of money which time and again down through history has resulted when a monarch or a leader has taken on the money system, they finish up dead. Today, virtually every other Bible in circulation contains a vastly different generic sentence from forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. For example, now most of you have probably seen the Good News Bible. It's in if you go and stay in a hotel or a motel, the Gideon Bible, that's the Good News Bible. And I picked up one in Port Lincoln the other day, and it says, forgive us the wrongs we have done as we forgive the wrongs that others have done us. Well, and if you check your own, you'll be amazed that other than the James I Bible, which that's much more accurate. So let us speed through a few more centuries to about AD 1861. Abraham Lincoln was suffering financial difficulties as he fought the Civil War against the Confederates of the South. And not surprisingly, and just like Julius Caesar, he'd run out of money. So he had his ambassadors and diplomats in Europe and England approach different banks for credit to continue paying his troops who were fighting the South. And effectively he was advised, yes, they would, each of them, they could finance him. But given, war is a risky business, Mr. Ambassador, and we've got to sort of, if you fail to pay, we've got to charge you a little extra interest over the prevailing 6, 7 or 8%. And he was offered money at between 24 to 36% interest, which he found completely unacceptable. So unilaterally, he commenced printing America's own money on green paper to identify it. And that is the origin of the greenback. He authorised the printing of some 340 million. Let it be fiat. He just said, print them, get on with it, do it. And they worked. Fiat money, let it be. The cost of printing that money was about 1/2 cent per note. And that's about what it is for today. $100 note, $5 note. The benefits that flow from controlling your source of credit is phenomenal, as the banks know. So today we've got, incidentally, printing that money does not result in national debt. There's no debt. It's amazing, but it's true. Today, America's debt is totally unrepayable. It did not begin its astronomical climb until the privately owned Federal Reserve of America system came into existence on the 23rd of December 1913. The Federal Reserve, everybody's heard of the Fed or the Federal Reserve of New York. There are 12 privately owned banks that form the Federal Reserve System of New York. Some of the others are Atlanta, Boston, Chicago, Dallas, Philadelphia, and so on. One of Abraham Lincoln's most powerful, truthful statements was, "The privilege of creating and issuing money is not only the supreme prerogative of government, but it is the government's greatest creative opportunity." Almost certainly what he did, and that speech, resulted in him being assassinated by William Booth. William Booth is alleged to have been drunk and, an actor in the theatre, and went out and plugged him in. But there's more to behind than that. Our transcontinental railway line is irrefutable proof or evidence of that supreme prerogative that Abraham Lincoln identified of what government can do in control of its financial future. Note well that America's national debt is now exploding by more than $1 trillion annually. It is ridiculous. I don't know whether you know what $1 trillion is, but you know, we think a billionaire's worth a few bob. A trillion is 1,000 million dollars. Okay, it's totally unrepayable. It's every if you can look it up on the internet, those of you who know how to use a computer, I don't. If you have a look at the top of an American greenback note, all their notes are green. It says in fine writing above American Treasury, it says Federal Reserve Note. Every note that's printed and numbered, no matter whether it's in my pocket, not out of circulation, is bearing interest against the American people. No different from our system. However, let's come ahead another 85 years or so. 1948 was a vintage year for private banking in general. Not only was Jesus' Prayer rewritten, the James I Bible was rewritten by a bunch of people in Canterbury in 1948. And the now generic, forgive us our wrongs as we forgive the wrongs of others, and let's all have a party and one thing. It's not specific, as Jesus wrote, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. So that was also the year that the international private finance really got its act together. The Bank for International Settlements had been established, that's the Baal, it's based in Baal. It's the absolute zenith or pyramid of the banking edifice. The International Monetary Fund was formed, and the beginnings of the General Agreement of Trade and Tariffs was established. The World Bank was established. So that was the second layer down from what had been established, the Bank for International Settlements. Then the World Bank, Bank for International Settlements, the GATT agreement commenced. George Bush Senior began publicising the push of banking with his words, the New World Order. You may remember that 20 odd years ago. The word started floating around the little phrase. That's now changed. You don't often hear the New World Order being mentioned anymore. Today we're being told about the wonders of the free trading global village system. We're all going to be members of the free trading, I call it the free trading global village idiot system. Together with the increasing anxiety, you talk to the average citizen, people are worried today. They don't know what's happening, whether with job, employment, their home loans, whatever. So we've been primed up for the free trading global village idiot system, together with the increasing anxiety of the average citizen who sees both his job, his family and his future being sacrificed as big business drives to impose its global village slavery on us. Now, this slavery is important to understand. In ancient, all through history, slavery has existed, including today. In ancient times, and even in Russia, China, Hitler's day, slavery was overt, it was imposed, and it wasn't necessarily vindictive, cruel, like the Egyptians built the pyramids and paid their slaves. But today, things have changed. It's no longer overt, it is now covert. It's camouflaged, the slavery. Today, it's effectively in the form of a mortgage. We're all on the same, banks are trying to educate us to borrow money, to get a credit card. They call it a credit card. Credit? Who's got the credit? They've got the credit and they're issuing debt. I mean, the deception that is involved in banking is unreal. And it's being imposed on it. It's not just us. Virtually every nation, doesn't matter whether it's the Reserve Bank of Japan, Canada, New Zealand, America, Australia, England, Russia. The one exception is China. China has a reserve bank, but its government still has control over, I think I don't really understand China, but she's not a fully fledged member of the world or the global financial system. But she still controls her yuan. It's fixed or virtually fixed. And that doesn't suit the rest of the world. The rest of the world banks, big business, want China to substantially increase the value of her yuan, so that trade becomes more difficult for China. She doesn't want to do it because she likes selling all her goods to us lot. Note well the business meetings. You may have heard of Davos in Switzerland, where annually the world's financial and political elite meet every year to discuss their progress and our increasing enslavement. I do note the passing, and you've been patiently listening to me, but can I leave you with 3 thoughts? First, seriously consider, if you contact Beata or some of the members of the League, get this. It's a wonderful Christmas present or for your friends or whomever. They describe the creation of our national CBA bank and the construction of the transcontinental rail line in detail. And there are references, irrefutable references in the back, if you can give your Polly's a copy. The booklets also describe the financing and physical delivery of other major national assets, like, for instance, apart from the transcontinental railway line, Australian woolen mills, Commonwealth oil refineries, Amalgamated Wireless Australia, Steamships? The Australian steamship line, and so on and so on. They're amazing little booklets written by a bloke called John Amos, J.D. Amos, who was an accountant. Second, I draw your attention to Premier Jack Lang of New South Wales, known as the Big Fella. He was, without doubt, one of Australia's greatest patriots. He wrote prolifically about his time as Premier of New South Wales and how the private financial system destroyed him, as during the Depression, 1932, the commencement of the building of the Sydney Harbour Bridge, he battled to get money to keep the construction going and to give work to his people to complete that bridge. But if you can, buy his book, Why I Fight. He wrote a series of books. They're amazing little booklets. And remember what Sir John Kerr did to Gough Whitlam, fairly confirmed by the people a month later, when the people overwhelmingly gave Whitlam the flick. Not that I'm promoting that's just the historic truth. But Sir Philip Game, who was the governor of New South Wales, at the behest of big business in London, organised getting rid of Jack Lang. He flicked him out of Parliament, and again called an election. It's shocking stuff, but you never hear about what Sir Philip Game did to Jack. I'd be very surprised if you've heard about what Sir Philip Game did to Jack Lang. So if you can find them, I don't know whether the League still has. I got my copy of Why I Fight, and I also got to tell you that I think it was you, Lou, that organised the 3 copies, basically the autobiography of Jack Lang's life, and I don't remember the titles of them. They're fascinating books if you can get hold of them. Third, a centenary is normally a time of celebration, and I'm of the opinion we should use the example of the centenary of the Transcontinental Railway together with our Commonwealth Bank of Australia as an outstanding practical example of what we could achieve. Could we emulate or copy our great-grandparents' actions by duplicating their actions? For example, now I wrote this when Arium was in Arium, for those of you who don't know, an Australian steel manufacturing company based at Whyalla, just north of Port Lincoln, 150 mile north of Port Lincoln. We know that it is, with its debt burden removed, it's a viable blast furnace. It needs a continuum of orders, and Australia needs to manufacture our own steel products, railway lines, wharf facilities, etc. I think Federal Parliament should have arbitrarily instructed the big 4 Australian banks to write off their $2.8 billion long-term debt. The debt write-off automatically becomes a tax-deductible claim for the banks. Can you believe that? Same as it does for us. If a business has a bad debt or something's going wrong, it's tax deductible, which is fair. No depositor loses a cent. The banks gain a tax deductible claim of $2.8 billion against their future profits, currently running at about $32 billion tax paid annually. So, The share price might slump for a few days, but it's not even 10% of their annual profit. They're written off the whole of the bloody debt at no loss to anybody. Could have done that. Remember, no depositor nor bank loses 1 cent. Next, Parliament could have arbitrarily acquired, if they wanted complete control, say 51 or more percent, if they wanted to leave people like you and me, little people, to buy a few shares in Arium or acquire a few, maybe they only have 49% or 30%. So we could still be owning Arium as a national asset, instead of which, whatever his name is, Mr. Gupta, well, that's a lost opportunity. And I've told you what Malcolm Turnbull could do tomorrow if he so chose, by raising his 8.4 million, by telling the Reserve Bank to create $8.4 billion and give it to me, please, and don't put it on your books, because the Reserve Bank does belong to the people of Australia, but the board tells the government what to do. Now, what the government created, the government can also take away. He could have told, well, he could do it tomorrow if he made up his mind to. So there's that opportunity, and surely if something like that were to be, can you imagine the reaction of the nation if Turnbull said, look, we've got miners who know how to handle heavy mining equipment, we've got more iron ore than we know what to do with, we're sending that by 1 million to 2 million tonnes a week to China, we'll keep a few tonnes back and we'll revitalise Arium and we'll have our steelworks functioning and we will build our own railway line, same as 100 years ago, centenary. We'll do for the East Coast, Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, a high-speed rail link with no national debt. God, would there be a celebration?
You said in 1924
yes.
they began to privatise,
yes.
But well, it split into the Reserve Bank and then...
No, that occurred, the Reserve Bank, and I'm definitely not correct on the date, but 30, 40 years later. What actually happened in Sir Denison Miller was a very, very highly stressed, overworked and ill man. And so he retired as the governor of the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. And on his retirement, 1924, the Bruce Page government appointed a board of directors, and he wasn't the first director, but Sir Robert Gibson, I think there was one chap who was the chairman of the board for a while, but the board consisted of big business and other bankers, and including this bloke Sir Robert Gibson.
Yeah, but we think just a few years back, Prime Minister Keating privatised the Commonwealth Trading Bank. So can you take me if they privatised it once, they couldn't privatise it again, but...
No, but we could create another bank. We could literally create a People's Bank of Australia. But yes, we could. You raised Keating. Paul Keating, as Bob Hawke's deputy and they weren't elected at the time, but as the shadow Prime Minister and shadow Treasurer, Keating promised his electorate and the people of New South Wales that he would defend the Commonwealth Bank of Australia and its government status, the Reserve Bank of Australia and so on. The first overseas trip he took was to America and was interviewed by bankers, and he came back and commenced. The bank had been, let's call it, castrated back in 1924 by the Bruce Page actions. But the sell-off of the share capital, and any of you had any brains at all, when Keating began the first tranche of bank shares, I think sold for about $2.50 or thereabouts to the Australian. Anybody could have bought them. I didn't buy them at that price, but anybody could have bought them. They were floated off to the and big banks took tranches of them, huge slabs of shares, and subsequently the whole show was sold off in about three tranches, I think. But Keating really destroyed it.
Peter, I've got a question about money, Australian money, but I must lead up to it. My study of the money system took place about 20 years ago, and during the course of my study, I got the Currency Act. Now, if my understanding of that's correct, if I'm a provider of services, goods or services, I've got a right to demand payment in, what was it calling it, a legal tender. Now again, there's limits on that in that I can't demand somebody to pay me $1,000 in $10 notes. They're only required to pay multiples of 10. So if they're $20 notes, it'll be 200, etc. But in Australia, if my understanding's right, we have two coins, the $100 and the 200, and they're gold coins. Now they contain gold value of more than their face value, but they are legal tender. Now they're supposedly limited edition or limited supply, but I don't know that that's true. The question is, would it be possible for, let's say, the Prime Minister of the country to demand a payment of his salary in legal tender, the highest denomination being $200?
Well, the answer is I don't know, and I admire you for having read the Currency Act. I'm not even aware of it. So, I mean, I've sort of read a fair amount of literature, but that I've not done. But having said that, I don't know. That's certainly true that some coins are minted from the two mints owned by the Commonwealth as investment items, and thus we have, what do they call them, people who trade, and you know, what's their title? Currency dealers and so on. Yes, exactly.
What I'm suggesting here is, like nobody in their right mind is going to purchase a $100 or $200 gold coin, which you're going to have to pay more than face value.
Yes.
But if you're the Prime Minister of the country and you could demand the payment of your salary in legal tender and say, "Now I want a $200 gold coin," it would be at face value.
I don't think I
Think
know.
about it.
No, I don't think I know that he could demand payment weekly in legal tender. That's law.
Yeah.
But not in gold coins. He could, so he gets paid, I don't know, whatever he gets, 300. So, yeah, 6,000 a year, so a week rather, thereabouts. He'd get it. Do you know the biggest? Do any of you know which is the biggest note circulating in Australia?
It's probably the $5.
No, it's a $100 note.
Oh, yeah.
It's the most printed. And how many times do you see $100 notes? Guess who's using $100 notes? Crooks. But the short answer is, if you demand legal tender, that's what the law says. You've got to be paid in it. And incidentally, that's one of the reasons why you might have used bank checks at some times. A bank check means if you are required to, I don't know, pay out or buy a mortgage, a bank will require a bank check from your bank. That means that behind that bank check lies the legal tender to honour it. So.
That's right, Peter. I was just, in the small amount of reading I've done regarding Sir Denison Miller, I was struck by what a character, a bit like you perhaps, he really was. He was looking for projects all the time to do, and he went on and on and on. So he was quite an extraordinary bloke. He seemed to have the national interest at heart.
Look, he would. Can you imagine being the governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia? No board to help you. Just amazing, amazing bloke. Well said.